Well, good afternoon. My name is David Chapman. I'm a professor of New Testament and Archaeology at Covenant Theological Seminary, and I'm here to address a short question. Why would Jewish people have found the crucifixion of Jesus to be a stumbling block? Now, this is supposed to be one of the One Tough Questions series for Covenant Theological Seminary, and one of the reasons this is a tough question for me to answer is that I've actually written two books that are pertinent to this, including one which was my doctoral dissertation. And so in 10 minutes, I'm going to try and give you a little snapshot of something that I found to be helpful with this question. Now, some of you might be even wondering where the question comes from. Well, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul says, and especially in this area that is underlined, that Jews ask for signs, that is, they're looking for miracles, and Greeks search for wisdom, that is, that they're interested in philosophy. But we preach Christ crucified, to Jews a stumbling block, and to Gentiles foolishness. This is part of his overall argument that the foolishness of God is wiser than the wisdom of men. But we can see, especially in these words here, to Jews a stumbling block, a question of why is this that to preach Christ crucified was to Jews a stumbling block? Now, in a quick kind of partial answer to this that I'm going to try and give over the next few minutes is simply this, that it has to do with how Jewish people perceive crucifixion and the role of the Messiah. If they were looking for a Messiah who would come, who would conquer, who would be the leader of the nation Israel, who would lead her back into the glory of her worship and one true worship to Yahweh, amid the Gentiles, many of whom had oppressed them and who the Messiah would conquer, then to have the Messiah crucified would have been shocking indeed. So let's come back to that in just a moment, but let me lay a bit of a framework here for it. First of all, I want to just give a quick aside that many of us assume that the cross has a very particular shape to it, namely a T shape, if you would. But in reality, and even in Judea and Palestine in the first century, we have evidence that the Romans could practice a variety of forms of crucifixion. So Josephus, who's a first century Jewish historian, gives a famous account that we'll come back to in a few minutes, in which he indicates that the soldiers, these are the Roman soldiers, out of their anger and hatred, for a joke, nailed in various forms those who had been captured. And he specifically calls these devices that they're attached to crosses. Stauroi is the Greek word. And so these are crucifixions, but they're various forms of crucifixion. Now, one of the reasons I make that caveat up front is that if we start looking at ancient sources about crucifixion, if they have to have a particular shape to them, and they have to have evidence in the sources for that, then we have very few sources. But on the other hand, if we look at the basic vocabulary that's used of cross and crucifixion, we have a wealth of sources, including a number from Judea and Galilee in the time of Jesus. And so we'll be looking at these that could constitute a variety of forms. Now, having said that, the few graphic images that we have from around the time of the first century do indicate a form that looks very similar to the cross shape that you and I are looking at. These typically come from Italy. So we have two graffiti. Here's one, a graffito from Puteoli, kind of near modern Naples, that shows a person with being hung up on a pole with a cross beam that their hands are appended to. And then here's another text, or another image, that is interesting in its own light. And I want to take a quick moment to look at this. You can see there's an individual here represented in the center of the image towards the top, who is on a cross-shaped object, hands appended to a cross beam right here, but with this weird head that looks clearly like the head of a donkey or a mule, naked. And then below him is a person with his hand raised in a posture that the Romans would associate with praise. And there is a graffiti here. Part of the graffiti involves this inscription that says Alexamenos Sebetetheu, which is Alexamenos worship God. And this, by the way, this image comes from the Palatine Hill in Rome, and is from, again, around the time of the 2nd century AD. And you have this person, presumably Alexamenos, with his hands raised in worship to God, and the God that he seems to be worshiping is a person who's being crucified and who has the head of a mule. Now, in Roman understanding of kind of pagan belittling, if you would, of attacks on Judaism, they would often associate Judaism with the worship of a donkey. They would say that in the Jerusalem temple, that they worshipped a donkey, that's what was actually in the temple. Now, this is historically inaccurate, but it is what Romans thought. And so what you have here is a person who's associated with this kind of ancient Jewish worship practice who's being crucified and is being worshipped by a man named Alexamenos. Now, this probably is a pagan Roman mockery of Christianity and with its Jewish associations and with its worship of a crucified individual, which may go some way to saying why Greeks and Romans might have opposed the gospel of a crucified Lord and Savior, if you would. But our purpose is to look at Judaism and to see if there's something similar in Judaism that may have caused a stumbling block for the Jews. Now, in this regard, I want to just say a few quick things. And again, if you want to look at these, I do have a book on this, on perceptions of ancient Jewish and Christian perceptions of crucifixion, is the title. And over a course of about 300 pages, I argue these basic points you have here, that Jewish people share views about crucifixion very similar to other people in the Greco-Roman world. These included the kinds of people who would be crucified, namely a kind of bandits, and I use the word bandit kind of like a brigand, a person who uses violence for the sake of stealing things. The thieves that Jesus is crucified between. The Greek word there is leistai, which actually refers to them being brigands, that violent criminals, if you would. So bandits, rebels, non-citizens, and slaves. And the Jewish people would have also known, because they would have seen in front of their own eyes, the sheer pain and shame of the event as somebody is crucified. However, the Jewish people also had some additional experiences that would allow them, for example, to connect crucifixion with scriptural examples of Old Testament people hung on a tree. So to put this in a slightly different way, there's two key differences for first century Jewish perceptions from kind of the general Roman pagan world. First, they knew many of their countrymen had been crucified, so they saw this going on regularly in Judea and Galilee. And second, they also knew Old Testament examples of people hung on the tree. Now, to the first point, I'll give you a couple of examples, both of them from Josephus, a first century Jewish historian, just after the time of Jesus. And he mentions, for example, this Roman governor who was governing the area of Syria that was also in charge of Judea and Palestine. There was a rebellion that was going on of Jewish people. And when Varus caught the leaders of that insurrection, he let go the people that seemed less important. But the most culpable, the main leaders of the insurrection, in number it says here, about 2,000 he crucified. This is within a few years of Jesus' own crucifixion. And it shows that a lot of people were crucified in Judea and Galilee in the time of Jesus. This would have been something that people saw fairly regularly. Now, interestingly, you can think of how, if you were a Jewish person in the first century, how you might then think of this. Some, seeing the need for the suppression of insurrection or revolt, may have very well thought that the Romans were doing, a typical Roman thing, and they might not have been super excited about it, but they would have understood it. Others, on the other hand, might have sympathized with the leaders of the insurrection. They don't like the Romans. And so they might very well have sympathized with the people who had been crucified. In any case, we see that this is a fairly common thing in the period. To give you another example of this, and I had given you a quote from this a few minutes ago, but I'll give you an extended quotation. Josephus, again, describing the Jewish revolt that happened around AD 70 when Jerusalem was hemmed in by the Romans, mentions that the Romans were trying to starve out people who were in Jerusalem, and people would try and escape, but the Romans had surrounded the city, and they would capture Jewish people who were trying to escape, and they actually ringed the city with crosses. So it says here that 500 or sometimes more are being captured daily. And Titus, who's the Roman leader, allowed crucifixions to go on, and the reason was it was such a horrible way to die that it was thought that the people in Jerusalem would just give up, allow themselves to be captured by the Romans, undoubtedly sold into slavery, which is actually eventually what the Romans did, but anything to avoid going to the cross. And it's in this context that, again, that passage I mentioned earlier, that the soldiers, out of rage and hatred, so angry that they have to undergo this long, arduous battle, amuse themselves by nailing their prisoners in different postures. And there were so many people being crucified that there was no longer space for the crosses, and there wasn't enough wood, enough crosses for the bodies. So that's a context, and actually we have, from around this time period, an example of a crucified individual, one of the two possible archaeological finds that can be associated with crucifixion, and the clearest of the two, was found in a bone reburial box, which is known as an ossuary, just outside of Jerusalem. And it's clearly from around the time of the 1st century. Here's that box, and you can see along the top the man's name, Yochanan, being inscribed right there. The reason this is an example of crucifixion is that one of his heel bones was found to have had a nail pierced through it. And so you can see on the left here an image of what a normal heel bone looks like. This was not the heel bone found in the ossuary. In the ossuary was found the one on the right. And here you have a heel bone with a nail penetrating through it. This is an artist's reconstruction of what that may have looked like. And then this is a actual model of this that you can now see in the Israel Museum if you go to Jerusalem. So again, you see the heel bone right here, and then a nail penetrating through it. From that, different postures have been suggested. The most likely one is the bottom right one right here, where a nail was used to attach each individual heel. And then the arms, in this particular body, there was some scratching on the arms, but not enough to indicate the use of nails. And so it's thought that in this case, the person's arms had been held up by rope. Now, probably different methods were used. The Gospels mentioned that nails were used in both Jesus' hands and his feet, and so probably slightly different for Jesus. But you can see a possible posture for his crucifixion. Now, what I want to turn to finally here is to show that there's a variety of Old Testament passages that mention somebody being hung up on a tree. So the Genesis passage here refers to Joseph, who is able to say of the cupbearer and the baker that one of them is going to be hung up by the Egyptian Pharaoh on a tree. Deuteronomy 21 legislates about the hanging up of a criminal on a tree. Joshua puts to death the king of Ai and then hangs him on a tree. Some of the 5 kings in Joshua chapter 10 are hung on trees. Ezra, there's a penalty that's threatened there, and then in the book of Esther. If we turn to the book of Esther, one of the striking things here, and by the way, I should say that of these passages, later Jewish treatments of these passages are going to clearly associate these with crucifixion. So the early Greek translation by Jewish people of the Old Testament into Greek is called the Septuagint. And in the Old Greek, the Septuagint of Esther, the word stauros is used to refer to the device on which the person's going to be hung. So the stauros, again, is a cross. And in this text, what's going on is that Haman, who is the arch nemesis of the Jewish people, is seeking to kill all Jewish people, and especially Mordecai, whom he hates very much. Mordecai, in a sense, along with Esther, are the heroes of the book. Mordecai is a Jewish person. Haman intends to hang him up on a tree. And what happens as you go through the book is that instead, through what I would argue is divine providence and the actions of Esther and Mordecai, the king of Persia finds out that what Haman wants to do, and instead has Haman undergoes the punishment that he had wanted Mordecai to do. So it's reversed on him. So Haman is hung up on the tree, on the piece of wood that he had established 50 cubits high for Mordecai to be hung up on. So imagine if you're a Jewish person, you're reading this and you're thinking, oh, this is a lot like crucifixion. Then the arch nemesis, if you would, kind of the Hitler of the ancient world, who sought to put to death all Jewish people, what kind of punishment did God make him suffer? Well, being hung up on a tree, being crucified, if you would. And in a similar way, Deuteronomy 21 also is associated with crucifixion in some key Jewish sources from right around the time of Jesus. And it speaks of a person, a criminal, who is put to death and hung up on a tree. And it says of that person that you don't leave that person up overnight on the tree, because it's said that he's a curse of God is the one who is hung on the tree. The Septuagint understands that as a curse, that person has been cursed by God. And so this text is, again, very important. And it was understood as being a crucifixion text by at least some Jewish people around the time of the first century. I mentioned this. Philo, who's a first century Jewish philosopher, says that this was a punishment that the lawgiver, that is Moses and really God himself, ordained as an extra retribution on those who took human life. That they should be crucified. And then you can see a clear quotation for Deuteronomy 21 here. That same Deuteronomy 21 text was used in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls to refer to what you do to a person who slanders God, and especially God's people who are representatives of God, who flees and kind of brings Gentiles against the Jewish people. That is written into the midst of the text of Deuteronomy 21 here. But then you can see, here's Deuteronomy 21, if there is in a man a sin bearing a judgment of death, then you shall hang him on the tree. And his corpse shall not spend the night on the tree, but you shall bury him in that day. And this text indicates, as they kind of switch some words around, that they expect this actually to be the means of executing the person. And again, this notion of a curse of God is associated with the one who is hung. Now, what do we do with that? Well, it would seem then that a Jewish person hearing of somebody who's being crucified may well associate that person with the curse that God brings on the person in Deuteronomy 21. And in addition, that person would look very much like the kind of arch nemesis of the Jewish people. Now, if that person then, if I were a Jewish believer in Jesus and came to you and said, I've met the Messiah and he was crucified, then hear what a stumbling block that would be. It would be a person who seems to have been cursed and who is undergone the very same death that our arch nemesis has done, and yet you say he's the Messiah? He was put to death by the Romans, yet the Messiah is come to deliver us from the Gentiles. So it's the exact opposite of what we expect. This indeed would be a stumbling block. The fascinating thing, and I meant to give you the text here, but I didn't, is what does Paul do with this in Galatians 3? Well, he takes that same Deuteronomy 21 text, and he says that Jesus indeed did bear the curse of being hung up on a cross. that Christ did bear that curse, but in doing so, he took the curse that we all deserve because of our sin, and he bore that on our behalf. That indeed what seemed to be foolishness to the Gentiles and a stumbling block to the Jews is instead the very mechanism for the salvation of God's people. Right. So there's a brief answer to how to interact with the question of why did Jewish people in the first century think that the crucified Christ might be a stumbling block? And then how did Paul help his Jewish colleagues see something much deeper and richer in the very crucifixion of Jesus the Messiah? Thank you for your time.